very, very happy to introduce to you our next speaker, Barbara Šurk, and also to break not just, let's say, but primarily the rhythm of panels. We now have a special slot, and then the panels will resume afterwards. Barbara Šurk is a journalist, essayist, and a long-time Middle East correspondent for the Slovenian newspaper Delo and also for the US news agency, the Associated Press. And she also contributed to New York Times and reported for them from the Balkans. She lived for a while in the Middle East, if 15 years is considered a while, and reported for the Associated Press from Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, the Persian Gulf, and so on. And also from Baghdad on the US invasion of Iraq, as well as the Palestinian uprising against Israel, Israeli occupation, the Hamas suicide bombings in Israel, and the Israeli attacks in Lebanon. After returning to Europe, she continued her journalism career in Brussels, where she was editor and reporter for the portal Politika. At the time when the Islamic State supporters attacked Paris and Brussels, the British at that time also decided to leave the EU. And clearly the Americans, that's the very same year, elected Donald Trump as president. Barbara occasionally reports today and edits for the Associated Press, covering former colonies in North Africa. Pardon? Former colonies of France. Yeah. Migration across the Mediterranean, and is writing a book on the Middle East, sort of political memoir based on memories of others. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It will be a little bit of a different presentation because I am not an academic as most of you are. My job or my living is based on observations I make on the field, and mostly by asking questions and storytelling from others. So bear with me. I have changed due to events that have unfolded in Israel, Palestine over the last month. I have changed a little bit my presentation and my talk to solely focus on one peace agreement, so-called peace agreement that has brought us to, or the background also of the peace conferences and peace negotiations and all the rest that has resulted in the so-called Oslo Peace Accords, and there were a few, in a way that brought us, that explains what is happening today and why it is so, why surviving peace is much more difficult than surviving war, particularly for the case of Palestinians, that as the events are unfolding, we are not entirely sure if they will survive this peace. I would like to start a little bit in the past and at the end, because you already had, if you will allow me, since I am not a political scientist by education or anything like that, I am a literature graduate, and I would like to read a couple of poems that explain the current situation and the past, perhaps also the future, much better than any kind of army archives or newspaper article at this point. I would like to start a little bit in the past, since I have to, especially because language is very important when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there are maybe 6 wars that have brought us to this present situation where we are. today, but if we count only since the Oslo agreements, maybe we're talking about 4 wars. So we all know that Israel was, as a state, was declared after the war of 1948. But before that, the predicament that the Palestinians find themselves in today actually starts a little bit back in the past. And that is with not only with the defining moment is the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is followed the First World War, in which, after which, when it was ended, the 2 imperial powers of the time, France and the Great Britain, have divided the Eastern Mediterranean territories amongst themselves, and the British started to advance on Palestine. That was already in sights of the European Zionist movement, which was eyeing Palestine as a homeland for Jewish population in Europe that was a victim of Christian European anti-Semitism that was rampant. Theodor Herzl visited Palestine once, and he went to, but he was actively working on having the aim was to populate Palestine, which was 95% Arab, and part of the Ottoman Empire, with Jewish population. There were, I have to say this because there were many Jewish communities around the Middle East thriving. In Palestine itself, I think the Palestine Jews were about 6% of the population, but thriving communities all around. Mostly they were Eastern Jews, and descendants of Jews from Spain who were expelled by the advanced Islamic armies at the time. So the way Herzl wrote about how they were going to go and change the demography, right? Because that was the main point. He wrote that it's possible to do this, and what he wrote, how to sort of take over, but over time, not overnight, and especially not with armies. Just a minute, I am a little bit of a, not very technologically advanced, but here is what he wrote in his diary, how this 6% of the population is going to be successful in, okay, I will do it like this. This is 1895, and it's an important component. I will not spend that much time on other things. We must expropriate gently the private property of the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it, the native population, 95%, employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out directly and circumspectively. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this is the plan. And and how you can go about this. In the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British are advancing. This is 1916, 1917. The British, who have already established Mandate Palestine, say, I think it is I don't know how many words, but one paragraph, short paragraph, that says that Palestine will be the homeland of the Jews. They will support it. And this is where the moment for Palestinians, this is the declaration that starts that puts this plan in motion on all levels. And it's the most crucial one that brings us today. And not only because of the plan, but because of the absence of one word. And that word is Palestinians, or Arab population. We are talking about a populated land, and all of these predicaments are, especially the Balfour Declaration, is talking like it's an empty land that will make home for some other group. We are not even going to ask. No, the native population has absolutely no say in this. This is important because this attitude continues in 1948, partition of Palestine, UN resolutions. Palestinians are not mentioned. They do not exist. They do not exist. They are mentioned, and most of all, not only that they are not mentioned, but they are also not part of any kind of talks or discourse or even plan for their homeland. They are never part of the conversation when their homeland within the borders of Mandate Palestine is discussed. So 1948 happens. Before that, there is an Arab revolt where the British use air power to bomb the native population. And of course, that supports the Zionist cause in Palestine tremendously. People start fleeing, Palestinians do start fleeing and leaving, but at the same time, what happens in Europe, of course, is Second World War, and the Jewish population is not only exterminated and has absolutely, the survivors of that war and that peace, most of all, have nowhere to go. Nobody would accept them, except many decide, in order to survive, to find a home in Palestine, which is still under British mandate, but they join militias, and 1948, more than half of the Palestinian population is either sent abroad, so transferred, flees, or is being expelled. These are the two words that have been used. And what the newly founded Jewish state has, they have a population. Because the survivors of the Holocaust, the European Jewry, has nowhere else to go. So the question of changing the demography has worked for the cause of populating the land. Then after the war, of course, they go and look for Jews in the Arab world and try to bring them over. They do. But this is a secondary thing. Whatever happens, another thing is very important, especially in the discourse and the words that we hear today a lot, and we have heard over the decades since the Jewish state has been established. One was the one that I already mentioned, that it was land for people with no people. The desert, the Jews made the desert bloom because they were working the fields and so on. So, in other words, the myth that Palestine thrived when it became Israel, because it was people without a land who finally got a state, that made it so, without, again, any kind of consideration that actually people have been there. These communities, this society was thriving in all intellectual, economic sense, and but it was systematically dismantled after 48, rapidly so. I mentioned the fleeing of Palestinians. There is a community that stays within the newly founded Jewish state. Mostly they are people who, a year after the declaration of Israel as a state, they come back, or as Israelis say, they infiltrated back over the border from Lebanon or from other places, from Syria, but through the Lebanese border. And they were all their homes were destroyed, and they went to, mostly to the West Bank, that was under Jordanian control at the time, but a lot of them stayed in Israel and congregated in the Galilee, around cities, urban centers like Haifa and Nazareth and so on. And they have lived under the Israeli military rule until the early 1970s. Another important thing to know, the most important thing I would say after that is, of course, the 1967 war, in which the Israelis decide to take the occupied, launch a war, of course, in response to some sort of Egyptian bombing or whatever. But they occupy the West Bank and Gaza, and most importantly, East Jerusalem with the Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif, the two holiest places for Jews and for Muslims. And they turned the national war, they turned the national war, they put a cloak of religion on it, which is another important thing. So this is how the military occupation, they also occupy parts of Egypt and Jordan, and but the important things are, of course, the biblical land for the Jews of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria and Gaza and Jerusalem. Another reason why this is important, this particular military occupation that lasts to this day, is because the Israelis were lost sympathy, international sympathy, for a tiny little bit, and the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution which is called the UN Resolution 242, and that is essentially a seed planted in the international law, at least, for a two-state solution. So, in other words, Israelis need to withdraw from the West Bank, from Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and other occupied lands in Egypt and Jordan, unconditional withdrawal. This, we now fast forward to the 1980s. Of course, there is no withdrawal. There are separate withdrawals from Jordan and from Egypt, and this is defined, and subsequently there are peace agreements between these two countries with Israel. But these are agreements between states. What is important is that the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem withdrawal does not happen, and this is the first time that Palestinian territories and Palestinians who are occupied are actually mentioned as Palestinians in United Nations resolution. So the Israelis' argument was, well, we would withdraw, but we have no one to talk to on the other side. Who do we talk to? Comes Yasser Arafat. He is in the exile. He's in Lebanon, organizing, sanctioning after this occupation, the military occupation of these territories, sanctioning armed struggle as to implement the right of return. so the refugees from 1948. And so all of a sudden, the Israelis have a, let's say, armed opponent on their side and on their border, not internationally recognized. This, with the armed struggle, Palestinians, and this is in 1968 that this happened. You probably know what 1968 was in Europe, and it's another important Palestinian struggle has sort of been for freedom, for return, for whatever lefty cause you were supporting at the time. It became sort of an international cry for freedom. And Arafat actually made it so because of his folklore that he was a very good PR person who had a keffiyeh. There was a sign of a Palestine, the way he laid it out, so this shape. It was very photogenic, and he spoke English funny, so this was a PR problem for the Israelis at the time. Where do we go from 242? We go to the fact that the military occupation is continuing. 1982 happens, and PLO is, this is another war that was supposedly going to bring peace. 1982, Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization are militarily expelled, let's put it this way, from Lebanon, meaning that the Israelis no longer have armed fighters on their border. They go to Tunis. In the meantime, Arafat and the PLO goes to Tunis after devastating bombardment of Beirut and southern Lebanon, and of course the occupation of Israeli forces of southern Lebanon. He goes to Tunis. The 1980s come around, late 1980s, early 1990s, but not yet. The uprising starts in the occupied territories against the occupation. The reason that this is very important is because it's a grassroots movement led by academics and civil society, very well organized. It's peaceful, unlike the second uprising that was continuation of an armed struggle. And but then what happens is the US bombs Iraq, the first Gulf War happens, and whenever the outside powers that the Israelis from the beginning of their state got on their side, whenever these imperial powers bomb another Arab country, Palestinians ultimately pay the price. And this has actually come a little bit of Arafat's doing as well, because he, in the Gulf War, he supported Saddam Hussein instead of the United States, like other Arab countries that desperately wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And Arafat loses, the PLO loses international funding. And when Saddam Hussein cuts missiles to Tel Aviv in response to the American bombing of Iraq, the Israelis realize that that is a formidable opponent who can actually bomb them, and they want none of that. What they want is, they want to talk peace. And what we then have is the beginning of contacts and secret negotiations. Okay. We begin secret negotiations. We come to the agreement with the so-called agreement. I'm sorry, I did the whole Palestinian thing when I was staying in 1948 way too long. The Oslo Agreement is not a peace agreement. We have contacts with the PLO is weakened. They have to make an agreement. The Israelis have elected Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister. He thinks that there is no appetite anymore in Israel to do war. So they have to find some kind of a way, not to do peace, but what they have to do is they have to find some kind of a way that would make Palestinians police themselves, not themselves, but police Palestinians so they won't be attacking Israel. And this is what Oslo Agreement ultimately comes to. It's based on 242 resolution, which is important, but what it also does is that the two-state solution of the one that we hear so much about today actually recognizes that Palestinians in those lands exist, and the peace agreement that has been another weapon for war actually mentions the first time that this is not an Arab-Israeli war. It's a Palestinian-Israeli war. So the Palestinians get their due. They are mentioned in the peace agreement that defines the war that is ongoing until today. The Oslo peace agreements are a variety of things, but what they are not are peace agreements. That was never an intention, because the famous White House lawn handshake between Arafat and Clinton was only designed, we do mutual recognition, you cancel armed struggle. That's exactly what Arafat did. And what Edward Said said, what the Israelis got with Oslo agreements is that Palestinians legitimized Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. It was sanctioned. Maybe I can stop here so that we can turn into this discussion and maybe bring it to the present day. But this is the most important thing to me, and I'm sorry I ranted for so long. The past is always important just because of this, because of the discourse to understand why Palestinians, almost to this day, never had a say of what happens with their land, what happens with their homeland, and what happens when they are in exile.
Thank you very much, Barbara.